Hello and welcome back to the Discover Reading podcast. Today our guest is Dr Tony Capstick, who is the director of our MA programs in teaching English as a secondary language and applied linguistics. We had a really fascinating conversation with Tony about the use of language and particularly English by migrants and refugees, and also some of the challenges that teachers might face when teaching people who have found themselves in that position, and also some of the ways that English has changed over the years, and some of the kind of political connotations and some of the weight of history that is bound up in using English. So a really fascinating conversation for you. So we hope you enjoy. Fantastic. Well, very warm welcome to you, Tony. Thanks a lot for coming on. Tell us who you are and what you do.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me to be part of the series. My name's Dr Tony Capstick. I'm an associate professor of language and migration, which means I'm very interested in research looking into the relationship between how migrants learn languages and use languages and what happens to their language when they arrive in new countries and when they move around the world. So I teach at the University of Reading in the Department of English Language and Applied Linguistics, and I carry out research in different parts of South Asia and the Middle East, as well as the UK.
Fantastic. And some people might question, such as Tony, for example, why is research on language and migrants still so relevant today? Or indeed somebody else might ask, in light of the current situation in Ukraine, is it more relevant today than it's ever been in recent history?
I could understand why they might ask those questions. Yeah, I think as we see these huge numbers of people moving around the world, forced migrants, as in the case of Ukrainian refugees at the moment, and more voluntary migrants that are always moving for work or for education, it becomes more pressing to understand what the implications are for things like the teaching and learning of new languages. So if you think about that example that you just mentioned, Chris, about Ukraine and refugees arriving in countries like Poland, I think about 2 million, or certainly the majority of the 3 million refugees leaving Ukraine at the moment are arriving in Poland, and many of those are children, and they're having to get into school and they're having to settle into a new environment. And so it's really important for us to be able to help teachers, education planners, policymakers plan for those kinds of language learning interventions that would help something like a Ukrainian teenager learn some Polish so that they were then able to join their new classmates in a classroom in Poland and settle into their new life, whether it's a new life that's going to take them back to Ukraine, hopefully someday, or whether it's more longer term settlement. You can see how, whatever the situation, language is really important to people getting to know their new environment.
Absolutely. And as you said, there's so many people displaced in Ukraine at the moment, and going to Poland and other countries. Is kind of the language and what happens when they get to those other countries something that is being addressed and at the forefront of people's minds, or is it just something that they kind of count once they get there?
Great question. We see both of those things happening. I hope we see more of the planned preparations going ahead as policymakers start to sort of see the value of that kind of preparation. But it depends on the resources of the context that refugees are arriving in. So at the moment, you've got something like 65,000 children enrolling into Polish schools. And there are special classes. We know that there are special classes now being provided by teachers, enabling those new students to learn a bit of Polish to fit in, which is great. And, sociolinguists like me, people who understand how languages are used in these settings, we can help teachers and teacher trainers to develop materials to help those students fit in. But of course, there's not always the kind of resources in place that would help those teachers cope. So I've done a lot of work in the 4 countries neighboring Syria, in countries like Lebanon and Iraq, and there you see, education systems that are already really stretched, and teachers that are already struggling with material or having had any kind of material, any kind of training to help newcomers settle in. And so, yeah, it depends a lot on the kind of existing resources of those particular schools.
One other thing I just wanted to ask you in perhaps in more general kind of linguistic terms. I was watching, obviously, President Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, quoting Winston Churchill to the House of Commons recently, and the speech that he quoted was about fighting to the end at sea, in the air, continue fighting whatever the cost, and that, like Winston Churchill's speech, that kind of gives you goosebumps, I think, and is very inspiring. And I was thinking in general terms about language, of why do you think language can be powerful or convince people to think differently or act differently just based on the tone and the words that are chosen?
Well, it's all those things you just mentioned. Yeah, they work together, don't they, to have a real impact on our emotional reaction to something. I think language is at the core of what makes us as human. It's the core of how we define ourselves. And so, if we have an emotional response, which most people do, to what's happening in countries like Ukraine at the moment, then we are already heightened to those linguistic tools that someone like President Zelensky is really good at harnessing. So I think what he did there was he knew his audience really well, didn't he? He understood this was a major moment to be speaking live to the UK Parliament in his home language, in Ukrainian, and you saw all the MPs with their little headsets on, and right back to ancient Greek work on rhetoric. It's all about knowing your audience and engaging with your audience's emotional state. And we saw him do the same. Was it yesterday in the German Parliament? He used metaphors around a wall, referring back to the fall of the Berlin Wall. And he talked about a wall being built now, a wall that divides freedom from bondage. So I think he's very, very resourceful when it comes to drawing from those historical moments that his audience will be familiar with.
Absolutely, and I think it's fascinating when you know what's going on, and you might have read about rhetoric in ancient Greece and in modern times. Even when you know that's happening, it still has that effect. But yeah, me and Chris wanted to ask a few more questions actually about kind of refugees and migrants. So, in your opinion, what are the main issues when it comes to working with refugees and migrants?
The first issue really to consider is which particular group of refugees or migrants it is that you're working with, and what is their cultural and linguistic background. So, I started out working with economic migrants. I'm from Lancashire in the north of England, and my hometown has seen significant amounts of migration from South Asia, from the Azad Kashmir part of Pakistan. So my PhD work about 10-15 years ago was looking at these transnational families that move between Pakistan and the UK. And so those are very specific, cultural practices that they draw on when they're, using their home languages, as well as when they're using, English, if it's not a dominant language at home. So what I learned from that kind of work and that research and visiting those parts of the world is that language is always related to the immediate context, as well as the immediate purposes that they need it for. So if you need language to get into university, you take your IELTS, or you do some kind of preparatory course, and then you get your IELTS 6.5, hopefully. The same with other purposes for using different languages in different contexts. So I think the first thing to keep in mind really is, how do we identify that the languages that people are bringing to their migration? And then if we're interested in helping them learn new languages, how do we harness those languages? How do we use those languages in the classroom to help them learn a new target language? Or if in the Syrian context, with lots of Syrians leaving Syria and moving to countries like Iraq, then, you know, they may be in the fortunate position that they're Arabic speakers and they know some Arabic, which would help them use Arabic in school settings. But then if they're in the northern parts of Iraq, in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, they're going to need to learn Kurdish. Or if they go to Turkey, they're going to need to learn Turkish. So there's always this relationship between the language of the country of destination and the languages of the country of origin.
That's fascinating, and it seems like if you're working in these situations, you need to apply yourself to the given and the particular context. So it reminds me a little bit from my current master's dissertation. I'm trying to focus on Afghanistan. One thing that struck me was when I was looking at Afghanistan, I didn't really realise before I researched it in terms of just how diverse the language of that country is, from countryside to city, from one valley to the next. And it's one of the great challenges the American and British soldiers had there, which is they might receive a certain language course, but that's not going to help them if they're deployed to another valley. But one of the curious things which we wanted to ask you is that, you know, it's quite hard to escape from the fact that the use of English is relatively dominant due to the factors of history, such as, for example, American cultural dominance, factors such as colonialism. Do you ever see any kind of resentment from that when you work with migrant communities, or any kind of resentment because of maybe, let's say, recent political events and interventions, or is that not something which is really apparent?
That is such a tricky question, because we do see that, you know, language is such a marker of culture, as you just described, Chris. And when we use a particular variety of English, whether it's American English or British English, we can't help but also attach certain cultural practices or stereotypes to that particular usage. And so, you know, languages carry those associations with them. And in the work that I do, we have this term called language ideologies, beliefs and attitudes that people hold about certain languages and certain kinds of pronunciation, perhaps, certain varieties. You know, in a university, you know, we need to use a standard variety. So yeah, those language ideologies are really powerful. And what we know is that they play out in different ways at different moments. I work with a lot of teachers in low resource settings, and because they haven't had the opportunities that someone like I've had to study language, from very recent research, we know that it's really important to use a learner's home language. But actually, there's a lot of very sort of traditional methodology that would try to keep those languages separate. And so then something like English then becomes just a tool for, perhaps some would argue, even more oppression, you know, not letting people use the languages that are familiar to them, that have an emotional attachment, as well as have pedagogic value. You know, you could almost suggest that, you know, English can be doing more damage than good. And we see this in countries that are now ex-colonies, where English is becoming installed as an official language or as a dominant language. And so, to go back to your use of the word resentment, you do see examples of resentment, but you also see alongside that examples of how people feel very attached to a language like English because it might bring opportunities for employment or education.
And just thinking about how that plays out as well in terms of migrants perhaps in the UK, and there's obviously a standard which we might call the Queen's English, and obviously there's an expectation that all people can speak English to a certain level. And there's also this kind of movement in the other direction where perhaps migrants to the UK use English in a non-standard form, and that then influences the native speakers of English as well. It's kind of a two-way street with English changing and evolving with migration. So I guess my point is, where do you stand in terms of people who say that everyone who speaks English should really be speaking the Queen's English? Or are you more on the side of, as long as you're conveying your point, that's the most important thing, and it's all just part of the convolution of the English language and all just part of it?
It is all a part of it, and languages are always evolving. And so whilst, for example, our learners, our students in the University of Reading, it's important that they have the tools to speak and write in the variety of English that we mark and assess them. We introduce them to the styles and the genres of English that are going to allow them to write those assignments and to give those oral presentations and not get marked down for what some people would call errors. Whilst I am fully supportive of all of that work, and for many years I was an English language teacher myself, I do think there's a lot of work to be done to, I suppose, demystify how evolving languages are. How it's you can't set them in stone. You can't freeze them and hope that everybody someday will speak a standard variety. That's just never going to happen. So I think that the solution for me is to give people the tools to be able to use the varieties that they need for particular purposes. So as you know, when you're on social media, you're not using a standard grammar. You're using acronyms, abbreviations, and that's all fine. But if you were writing assignments, you'd also need the tools to write the assignment in the variety of English that ultimately we're expecting students to come up with. So I'm very, very supportive of helping students master these dominant varieties, but I do think we've got a lot of work to do to break down some of these language ideologies that I mentioned that suggest that somehow some varieties are better than others.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because you mentioned you were an English language teacher. I'm guessing that may have been at secondary level. I wasn't a very good English teacher, but I did teach it for a year or two. And one thing that did strike me when I was teaching it was, and again, I'm not trying to necessarily make a political point here, but I thought it was interesting how down the years Shakespeare becomes such a dominant part of the curriculum. I found actually quite hard to teach because so much of it was quite hard to access. And I realised when I was teaching, it was so hard for so many of the kids who access it. And some of the books, actually, which they enjoyed the most were some of the, let's say, more global books. So, To Kill a Mockingbird, and of Mice and Men. And that was the kind of stuff which was being cut down upon in the curriculum. And I always felt potentially that was a shame. Do you think actually this is something maybe we could do more at school level, which is not just focus on, let's say, Old English, traditional English, but try and actually understand English at that secondary age in quite diverse forms? Because for one thing, it can give, the kids and the students an access into certain kinds of books and introduce them to certain kinds of different dialects of English at quite an early age.
I think you put it perfectly there, Chris. I think you need that variation, definitely. You need texts, perhaps, from more kind of classical texts, with all of those Shakespearean themes that we can use to learn about the world. But yeah, we need more contemporary texts, and we also need texts taken from different parts of the world, and not just texts maybe that have stories from these other places, but also use some of these different varieties of English. Again, we don't have to just stick with the standard British English or even standard American English, but we can bring in, literature from Africa, literature from across Asia, where English is used. Some fantastic Pakistani authors that I read that write in English, but they often write in a more localized Pakistani variety of English. And to introduce those into the kind of classrooms that you're talking about, Chris, I think is a very successful way of helping our students understand that there is all of this variation, and that by reading a story that uses those different kinds of English, we're automatically opening a door to other ways of seeing the world.
Excellent. And I think this brings us quite neatly on to our next question then. So how can sociologists help design language learning programs for refugees and migrants?
Well, so I'm a sociolinguist. So what that means is I look at this relationship between language and society, and how something like language and culture really are part of the same thing. So what we do when we design language learning programs is that we do the things that we've just been talking about. We look at the languages that the learners are bringing to that lesson, or the teachers, or the particular context that that school is in, and we design materials, so write materials, we make resources for teachers, for students, that allows them to develop what we call multilingual pedagogy. Pedagogy, so teaching and learning that doesn't keep these languages separate, but brings them together and shows the teacher how to use them strategically. So there are things that a teacher can do to what we call scaffold, which means build towards the new target language, and they can use the home language to do that. But of course, they need to know how. They need to know what to do in those classroom interactions. They need to know what to do and what to say, and how to build that knowledge together to enable their students to move closer to learning this new target language. So I think that what the sociolinguist brings is that expertise around multiple language use, the relationship between language and culture, as well as a more qualitative approach to understanding the wider context that the learner is learning in.
I think you might have touched on this already a little, but I was wondering if there are what you could call them mistakes or common things that teachers do when they're teaching refugees and migrants, which is something that sociolinguistic linguists pick up on and can improve upon in the classroom. Obviously, they're not doing it on purpose, but it's just something that's quite common.
Things that teachers struggle with, particularly with refugees, is understanding how to deal with trauma in a classroom. So I'm not saying all refugees are traumatized. Many refugees are in a fortunate position that they've not. People flee different kinds of persecution, not just conflict. But the refugees we've been talking about today are particularly like Ukraine and Syria. They are fleeing conflict. They have experienced huge amounts of adversity. And teachers, not through any fault of their own, but because they've not had opportunities for professional development, they don't always understand the relationship between classroom behaviors and classroom language and a traumatized learner, or a learner who is dealing with some kind of difficulty, whether that's at home or whether that was a previous event that they experienced. I mean, and we also learn about vicarious trauma. So if a teacher can experience vicarious trauma through her learners, she may not have experienced it herself firsthand, but the learners, in bringing it into the classroom, they also are under a huge amount of pressure and stress. And so what we know from the research that we carried out in the 4 countries neighbouring Syria is that there are really good examples of good practice. Many NGOs run very successful psychosocial support programs. But unfortunately, I think one of your earlier questions was about who's responding to these massive migrations. And I mentioned ministries of education and the government. And in very low resource contexts, government can't always find the funds or choose to spend the funds on other things. And so their teachers never experience the kind of training that would help them understand this relationship between trauma and language and learning as well. So I think that's one of the main challenges that a lot of teachers face.
Absolutely, and I think that really brings home the challenges. One other thing me and Chris wanted to ask about is, obviously we've been talking about migration and learning English, and perhaps your advisory role within that. We're also interested in you teaching about this at the university. So how do you teach about language and migration at Reading?
I've been very lucky that I have a very supportive head of school who has encouraged me to design 2 new modules that didn't run 5 or 6 years ago, but are running now. So I convene a first year module, part 1 BA module called Globalization and Language, which is a very introductory module to some of the things that we've been talking about today. But at quite a low level, these are part 1 students who've just arrived at the university. And so we look at what globalization is, this kind of worldwide interconnectedness, and how communications are getting faster, and how language is part of that. You know, language that we use on social media facilitates some of these transnational migrations that we've been talking about. But the other module that I teach to MA students and to our final year undergraduate students is a module called Language and Migration. And in that module, I start with a historical perspective. I think some of the countries that we've been talking about today, you know, I think Chris mentioned Afghanistan. You know, when you look at that language profile, you see the people that have come from outside and been involved. So, you know, Persian is in the mix from that part of the world, as well as English. So by taking a historical perspective, we can look at some of these countries and we can see how current day language use, where it's come from, you know, where is this mixture emerged from, and often that's a result of migration, of course. So we look at that, we look at colonialism, we look at what happened when countries like England went out into the world and colonized huge parts of the world and then imposed their language on that country and on the bureaucracies of that country. So English is a dominant language in lots of countries, and it's the language of power in those countries. So that's probably not going to change in any time soon. But what does that mean for people who don't have access to English? So we look at some of these socio-political aspects of language and migration. We also look at some of the multilingual pedagogies that I mentioned, helping teachers plan for this kind of language learning situation. And then we also look at the language of higher education. So we have a nice project with universities in Pakistan and Iraq, and they partner with our students in Reading, and they do a mini project looking at the varieties of English that each of them uses, either in their everyday life or in their academic assignments.
That sounds incredibly packed, and but I'll quickly go over to Phil. Phil, have you got any closing questions before we wrap up for today?
Yeah, maybe just quite a broad one actually. But I just wondered, Tony, what's your thought on language being such a powerful marker of cultural identity? It could be seen as the biggest marker of cultural identity, and I wondered what your thoughts were on why that is.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. As soon as we use a particular expression or a particular pronunciation, or move from one language to another, we're saying a lot in that moment about who we are, and it's not always that we're the one that's saying it either. It's what our interlocutor is taking from that. You know, this thing about language ideologies. What's remarkable about language ideologies is it's not often about the language, is it? It's about what that language stands for. It's not that we really care too much about somebody, using a particular pronunciation pattern that's more commonly associated with something like, let's use an example from where I grew up. I grew up using a variety of English, very common in Lancashire. And when I go back to Lancashire, my family are horrified because I don't sound like that person anymore, and they think I've gone all posh. And now I'm working in a university. I'm trying to sound different, and of course I am trying to sound different because we use language to accommodate the people that we're working with, the people that we're living with. And so to go back to your question then, Phil, yeah, I think it's not so much that it's the actual linguistic feature that is the problem. It's what that stands for in other people's perceptions.
Okay, perfect. I think perceptions is a very nice way to go and wrap up this particular episode. So it just remains for me to say thank you very much to my co-host Phil, and of course thank you so much to you too, Tony. It's been an absolute pleasure to chat with you, and you're welcome back on the pod anytime.
That'd be great. Thanks, guys.
Well, we do enjoy bringing you original and outside the box thinkers on the Discover Reading podcast. Tony certainly fits that criteria, and that always makes for a great episode. Clearly, therefore, the importance of language cannot be understated. Its impact upon society, culture, and the relationship between nations and peoples is there for everyone to see. Thank you, and we'll see you on the next episode.